Have you seen this dumbbell curl variation popularized by Dr. Mike? If you have, tune in, because today we're going to debunk it just from the perspective of why maybe it's not the best curling option that you could be doing, and what you can do instead and how to fix the problems with the exercise, because honestly, it's a pretty easy fix, even if you only have access to dumbbells and a bench. So the first thing that I want to say just before we get into the X's and O's here is that nothing about this has to do with Dr. Mike. And personally, I think Mike does a fantastic job of explaining a lot of different concepts to a very broad audience. And I think that on net, Mike is a huge positive in the science-based education space, from the perspective of making information more accessible to people who otherwise just wouldn't be able to understand this stuff to any degree. So nothing personal here, just want to debunk the exercise. And I think that what we need more of on these kinds of platforms is like respectful disagreement, because disagreement is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And ultimately, it's what actually pushes this industry forward from a knowledge perspective and what makes people better, right? As long as we can actually do it like adults and not like little children that are throwing ad hominem insults at one another every time they talk about each other. Okay, just with that disclaimer out of the way, here's kind of the curl setup, right? And just pretend that there's a bench underneath of this person, they're doing the curl. If we think about what the resistance of the dumbbell is doing to the body in this position, well, it's just acting downward, right? And so the line of force of the dumbbell is going like that. And for those of you who may or may not be familiar with torque stuff and moment arm stuff, those are basically just fancy terms for what we're about to describe. What you would want to do ideally to see how much force is on the elbow versus the hand versus the shoulder is you would want to be able to actually extend this line upward like this. Okay, and more accurately, the elbow joint in my stick figure diagram is probably somewhere like here. Okay, and if we want to identify the force in this position on the elbow versus the shoulder, again, we're just assuming that the shoulder is somewhere in this stick figures, you know, right here. Okay, we'll just pretend that that's the collarbone, this little segment. The way that we would identify the force in the elbow is basically looking at this horizontal distance here, i.e. this triangle and what this horizontal line is, versus the shoulder forces, which is this line, right? So in the bottom position, just look at either line and say, is this line longer or is this line longer, right? And in this particular context, this line is much longer. And what that means in simple terms is more torque, in other words, more resistance is placed on the shoulder joint in this position as compared to the elbow. And especially depending on how you execute it, like if you're intentionally holding your arm farther upward, then that discrepancy would actually change even more. And so what happens is as this person moves through a curl, right, and the forearm travels, let's say, up to here, okay, and I'll try to erase some stuff so it's a little bit more clear. Here is the dumbbell now, and here is the line of force that the dumbbell is creating. And now to identify what the resistance is on the elbow and the shoulder, here is the elbow force, that distance, or at least part of what creates the elbow force, and here's the shoulder force. So shoulder force, elbow force. And again, at its peak, you know, the elbow force would be roughly this long, the dumbbell would need to be a little bit lower, but in essence, this is the distance of the elbow now, and this is the distance of the shoulder. So at every single point in the range, there is more force that is being imposed, more resistance rather, being imposed on the shoulder as compared to the elbow. And if we looked at any other exercise for any other muscle, we would think that this is nonsensical, right? If you were doing a seated leg curl and you refused to put the thigh pad down and you tried to do the curl, there would be more force that would just be trying to pull you upward out of the seat as compared to force that would directly go onto your knee so that you could train your hamstrings in that context, right? And this applies to all exercises. We want the most amount of resistance to be applied to joints that we're actually trying to isolate, especially in a bodybuilding context and any context within which you're trying to target a specific muscle group. So what's the solution to this and how can we actually improve this? And again, the perceived benefit at least is that you get that extra stretch with your arms behind your body. Whether or not that's actually the case will depend on how the individual is actually orienting their arms and whether or not they're just tipping their shoulders forward or whether they're actually getting back. But in any case, I think that the solution to this is basically to find something that you can put underneath of the arm that way. Why? Well, because anytime that we have a support, imagine a preacher curl, what we're in essence doing is we are placing something here that can take up the load that would otherwise be put on the shoulder. And so the way that we can easily do this in the context of this kind of dumbbell curl where we're lying backward and we're trying to get a stretch is to actually, and I'll put a video of this up, of course, is just to rotate so that you're 90 degrees, your torso is 90 degrees from the bench, right? So rather than lying parallel to the bench, what you do is you turn your body 90 degrees so that you can basically just hold like an isometric hip thrust, super easy to hold, at least for most people who are trained, right? And just basically place the side of the bench underneath of the arm so that you can actually support the upper arm, and so that you don't have to, again, as we went over, incur 2 times potentially more force, more resistance rather, on the shoulder as compared to the elbow. And so even in that context, you can still pull your chest up as high as you want to get that relative stretch of the biceps behind the body. But now in a circumstance wherein instead of having to coordinate all the motion and all the force and resistance at the shoulder, you now basically only just have the elbows and the elbow flexors, i.e. the biceps, the brachialis and the brachioradialis, to really worry about doing the work, right? So in essence, what you're doing just by turning 90 degrees and using that support is taking all of the shoulder stabilizing stuff out of the equation, i.e. if you feel your front delts doing this, if you feel your pecs doing it this way, that's no surprise. Those muscles need to contract if this is the force scenario that you are setting up. But eliminate that requirement and eliminate that sort of stability need in those non-target tissues. So I hope this helps. I hope this was a good sort of lesson in just sort of maybe drawing out force diagrams and understanding this across multiple scenarios. If you want to see a similar video in terms of maybe what the problem here is and what you might be able to do about it in another context, check out my recent video on dumbbell triceps kickbacks. That video is a very similar theme to this one, which is to the idea of more force being placed on the shoulder as compared to the elbow. And so if you can sort of start to see this in multiple contexts, you in your own training can start to make better training decisions, again, from a context-specific standpoint.